There are places that disappear from maps not because the people left, but because someone with a pen decided they should not exist. Not a fire, not a flood, not the slow forgetting of time, a deliberate erasure. The kind that requires ink and authority and the quiet cooperation of men who understand that certain truths, if they are allowed to stand, will make certain arrangements impossible to maintain. Sorrow's Gate was a town in the Mississippi Delta in 1868. It had a church, a school, a mill, a post office, and 412 people. It had land deeds, signed and witnessed and recorded in the county courthouse at Vicksburg. It had a market that ran on Saturdays. It had a teacher named Cora Fell who had walked 40 miles from Memphis to get there. It had a man named Solomon Vass who had built its first building with his own hands in the spring of 1866, 2 years after the war ended, on land he had legally purchased with money he had earned. By 1871, Sorrow's Gate did not appear on any official map of Warren County, Mississippi. By 1875, its land deeds had been reclassified, reissued, and recorded under different names. By 1880, the courthouse that held the original records had suffered what the county register described as a partial archive loss due to water damage. And by the time the first journalist thought to ask questions, a woman named Marin Hobbs writing for a black newspaper in Chicago in 1887, there was almost no official record that Sorrow's Gate had ever existed at all. Almost. Before we go further, if you have never heard the name Sorrow's Gate, you are about to understand not just what happened there, but why the machinery of its erasure was so thorough, so patient, and so precise, and why the people who built that town made sure, despite everything, that the machinery did not entirely win. Stay with us. This story has been waiting a long time to be told. To understand what happened to Sorrow's Gate, you first have to understand what it was, not just as a settlement, not just as a name on a deed, but as an idea that certain men found unbearable. The Mississippi Delta in 1866 was a landscape in the middle of a transformation that its white landowning class had not accepted and did not intend to accept. The war had ended, the Confederacy had lost, the 13th Amendment had been ratified, and the federal government, through the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, what most people simply called the Freedmen's Bureau, had arrived in Mississippi with a mandate to do something that had never been done in American history: to help 4 million people who had been systematically stripped of everything — land, labor, literacy, family, name — begin to build a life. The Bureau's mandate was enormous. Its resources were inadequate. Its personnel were inconsistent, ranging from men of genuine conviction to men who saw the chaos of Reconstruction as a different kind of opportunity. And it operated in a state whose white political class had responded to military defeat by passing a set of laws, the Black Codes of 1865, so nakedly designed to re-enslave black Mississippians under a different legal name that the federal government had thrown them out and placed the state under military governance. Into this landscape in the spring of 1866 came Solomon Vass. He was 34 years old. He had been born enslaved on a cotton plantation outside of Natchez, the property of a man named Creighton Aldis, who had been, in the particular accounting of that world, neither the worst nor the best of the men who held other people as property, which is to say, he had been exactly as brutal as the system required and called it management. Solomon was not a man given to sentiment. He was a man given to precision, the particular precision of someone who has spent his entire life navigating a world designed to destroy him, and has survived by understanding that world's mechanisms more completely than its architects intended. He knew how land purchases worked. He knew what a deed was. He knew the difference between possession and title. He knew that in the world that was supposedly being built after the war, title was going to matter in ways it never had before for people who looked like him. By March of 1866, using $31 he had saved and a transaction brokered by a Freedmen's Bureau agent named Theodore Ashworth, a Massachusetts man of earnest but limited imagination, Solomon Vass purchased 6 acres of bottom land on the eastern edge of Warren County, Mississippi, along a tributary of the Yazoo River called Wren Creek. He built a structure on that land in the first week of April, a single room, 12 feet by 14, timber frame, with a roof that did not entirely keep the rain out. He slept in it that first night and listened to the creek and made a list in his head of what came next. What came next were other people. They came because word traveled, and in the spring of 1866, word was traveling faster than it ever had among the people it concerned most. The war was over. Land could be purchased. The Bureau was present, however imperfectly. And there was a man on Wren Creek who had already done what people were whispering about doing, who had put his name on a piece of paper that said, "This land is mine, witnessed and signed, and you cannot take it." The second family arrived in May, a man named Henry Cutter, his wife Josephine, and their 3 children, who had been working a sharecropping arrangement on a plantation north of Vicksburg and had understood within 1 season what that arrangement actually was: the same work, the same control, the same essential imprisonment, with the word contract substituted for the word ownership. Henry Cutter ended the contract, which his former enslaver had characterized as a breach, and the Freedmen's Bureau, to Theodore Ashworth's credit, had characterized it as his legal right. The Cutters purchased 4 acres adjacent to Solomon's parcel. Then came the Pruitt family, then a man named James Abel, a carpenter, who had been free before the war, born free in New Orleans to a free woman of color, and who had come to Mississippi because he understood that the next 10 years were going to determine whether freedom meant something real or whether it was going to be negotiated down to nothing. And he wanted to be somewhere that was trying to make it mean something. James Abel built the second permanent structure at Sorrow's Gate. It was a proper building, square corners, fitted boards, a door that hung true. And in that building, beginning in the autumn of 1866, he ran a carpentry shop that made furniture and repaired tools and did the kind of work that a growing community required. He was also the person who named the place. He named it Sorrow's Gate because, as he explained to Solomon Vass one evening sitting on the step of Solomon's first structure, this was where you came through sorrow, not where you stayed in it. The gate was the threshold. You passed through it. What was on the other side was what they were building. Solomon had looked at him for a moment and then said it was a good name as long as everyone remembered which direction the gate opened. By the end of 1867, Sorrow's Gate had 43 households. By the middle of 1868, it had 412 people. A church built by collective labor over 3 Sundays in August, a school operating in the church building on weekdays, and Cora Fell standing at the front of it with a piece of chalk and a certainty that what she was doing mattered that radiated from her so powerfully that children who had never been told their minds were worth anything absorbed it without being told. It had a post office, which meant it existed in the eyes of the federal government as a place, a named location with a specific address. This would become important later. It had a community council of 7 people elected by the households of the settlement that met on the first Sunday of each month to manage the decisions that a community of 412 people inevitably needs to make. Solomon Vass served on that council. So did James Abel. so did a woman named Ruth Carey, who had been a midwife for 20 years and whose authority in the community derived from the simple arithmetic of how many lives she had brought into the world and kept in it. It had enemies, not because it had done anything to make them, but because its existence, a legally established black community with clear title to its land, its own governance, its own school, with its own children learning to read, was an argument that certain men could not afford to allow to stand. The first of those men was named Harlan Brace. Harlan Brace was 49 years old in 1868. He had been, before the war, one of the larger cotton planters in Warren County, with 800 acres of delta bottomland and the labor of 61 enslaved people to work it. He had lost the war in the specific way that men of his class had lost it, not physically, not in battle, but in the destruction of the economic system that had made him what he was. He had not lost his land. This is the crucial thing to understand about the post-war South that official history tends to underemphasize. The Confederacy lost. The planter class did not lose their land. The talk of 40 acres and a mule, the promise, the policy that would have redistributed some portion of Southern land to the people who had worked it, had been abandoned by the federal government before it was ever fully implemented. The land stayed with the people who had owned it before the war. The labor that had made it valuable was now theoretically free. What Harlan Brace had lost was a labor force. What he needed and what the black codes had been designed to provide and the federal government had refused to sanction was a mechanism to get that labor back at terms that made his cotton operation profitable. What he was watching from the gallery of his house 3 miles west of Wren Creek was a community of 400 people who had decided not to provide it. He was not, by the accounts of people who knew him, a man of obvious violence. He was a man of patience and process, which in the Mississippi Delta of 1868 was in many ways more dangerous than violence, because process left records, and records could be made to say whatever process needed them to say. He was also a man with relationships, with the county assessor, with 2 of the 3 county commissioners, with a state legislator named Fowler Dean, who had, in the particular quiet of private conversation, made clear that the period of federal oversight in Mississippi was not permanent, and that the men who were prepared to act decisively when it ended would be the men who defined what came after. Harlan Brace began acting decisively in the summer of 1868. The first action was a tax reassessment. The parcels of Sorrow's Gate were reassessed for property tax at values that bore no relationship to their market worth, values calculated, as Solomon Vass recognized immediately, to make the tax burden on the settlement's households so high that meeting it would require income that small-scale subsistence farming could not generate. The reassessment was signed by the county assessor, a man named Dewey Pitts, who had held his position for 11 years and who owed 3 different financial favors to Harlan Brace that were never written down and never needed to be. Solomon took the reassessment to Theodore Ashworth at the Freedmen's Bureau. Ashworth reviewed it, agreed that the valuations were irregular, wrote a letter to the county assessor's office, and received no reply. He wrote a second letter. He received a response 3 weeks later stating that the valuations had been conducted according to proper procedure and were not subject to further review. Ashworth filed a report with the Bureau's regional superintendent in Jackson. The report entered the administrative process. It was 3 months before anyone responded to it, and the response when it came was a suggestion that the affected households attempt to negotiate directly with the county assessor's office. Solomon read the letter that Ashworth showed him and sat very still for a moment. Then he asked Ashworth in a voice that carried no anger, but something harder than anger, the flat, specific clarity of a man who understands exactly what he is looking at, whether the Bureau intended to do anything. Ashworth said he would continue to pursue the matter through available channels. Solomon thanked him and left. He did not tell the community everything about that meeting. He told them what was necessary, that the tax challenge was proceeding, that they should continue to meet their payments as best they could, and that he was working on other approaches. He did not tell them what he had seen in Ashworth's face. He had seen the face of a man who believed in the right things and did not have the power to enforce them, and knew it. That was its own kind of information. What Solomon did not yet know, what none of them knew, was that the reassessment was not the primary instrument, it was the preparation for one. In the autumn of 1868, a man arrived in Warren County from Jackson. His name was Clement Farr. He was employed by the state's newly reorganized land office, an office that had been, in the chaos of Reconstruction governance, substantially rebuilt with personnel whose primary qualification was not expertise in property law, but loyalty to the political network that was preparing to reclaim Mississippi's state government from federal oversight. Clement Farr was 31, thin-featured, with the unhurried manner of a man who understood that his work was not urgent because time was on his side. He spent 2 weeks in Vicksburg reviewing county property records. He was specifically interested in deeds executed under the Freedmen's Bureau oversight in 1966 and 1967, deeds like the ones that established the land titles of Sorrow's Gate. What he was looking for, and what he found after careful examination of the documents, was something that the Bureau's agents, well-intentioned, overworked, often legally untrained, had frequently failed to ensure: proper chain of title. The parcels purchased by Solomon Vass and Henry Cutter and the other founding families of Sorrow's Gate had been purchased by the Bureau, which had acquired them as abandoned or confiscated Confederate land. But in several cases, the documentation establishing the Bureau's right to sell those parcels was incomplete. Not fraudulent, incomplete. Missing a step, a signature, a recorded transfer in the chain that led from pre-war owner to Bureau to purchaser. These were technical deficiencies. They were the kind of thing that, in a functioning legal system with a genuine commitment to the rights of the purchasers, would have been corrected as a matter of course, the gap filled, the chain completed, the titles confirmed. They were also, in the hands of a man like Clement Farr, in a state where federal oversight was weakening and local power was reasserting itself, the beginning of everything. Farr filed his findings with the State Land Office in November 1868. The findings ran to 22 pages of careful legal prose. They concluded that the titles of at least 31 of Sorrow's Gate's land parcels were technically clouded. Not void, the document was careful about this. Not void, but subject to legal challenge on the grounds of deficient documentation in the chain of transfer. The document was not published. It was not sent to the Freedmen's Bureau. It was not shared with the landholders it concerned. It was filed in the State Land Office in Jackson, where it sat, waiting, for nearly 3 years. That waiting was the most important part of Clement Farr's work. The document was not a weapon to be used immediately. It was a weapon to be used when the conditions were right, when the federal oversight had diminished enough, when the political climate had shifted enough, when the men with the authority to act on it were the men who wanted to use it. Harlan Brace began acting decisively in the summer of 1868. The first action was a tax reassessment. The parcels of Sorrow's Gate were reassessed for property tax at values that bore no relationship to their market worth, values calculated, as Solomon Vass recognized immediately, to make the tax burden on the settlement's households so high that meeting it would require income that small-scale subsistence farming could not generate. The reassessment was signed by the county assessor, a man named Dewey Pitts, who had held his position for 11 years and who owed 3 different financial favors to Harlan Brace that were never written down and never needed to be. Solomon took the reassessment to Theodore Ashworth of the Freedmen's Bureau. Ashworth reviewed it, agreed that the valuations were irregular, wrote a letter to the county assessor's office and received no reply. He wrote a second letter. He received a response 3 weeks later stating that the valuations had been conducted according to proper procedure and were not subject to further review. Ashworth filed a report with the Bureau's regional superintendent in Jackson. The report entered the administrative process. It was 3 months before anyone responded to it, and the response when it came was a suggestion that the affected households attempt to negotiate directly with the county assessor's office. Solomon read the letter that Ashworth showed him and sat very still for a moment. Then he asked Ashworth in a voice that carried no anger, but something harder than anger, the flat, specific clarity of the man who understands exactly what he is looking at, whether the Bureau intended to do anything. Ashworth said he would continue to pursue the matter through available channels. Solomon thanked him and left. He did not tell the community everything about that meeting. He told them what was necessary, that the tax challenge was proceeding, that they should continue to meet their payments as best they could, and that he was working on other approaches. He did not tell them what he had seen in Ashworth's face. He had seen the face of a man who believed in the right things and did not have the power to enforce them, and knew it. That was its own kind of information. What Solomon did not yet know, what none of them knew, was that the reassessment was not the primary instrument. It was the preparation for one. In the autumn of 1868, a man arrived in Warren County from Jackson. His name was Clement Farr. He was employed by the state's newly reorganized land office, an office that had been, in the chaos of Reconstruction governance, substantially rebuilt with personnel whose primary qualification was not expertise in property law, but loyalty to the political network that was preparing to reclaim Mississippi's state government from federal oversight. Farr was 31, thin-featured, with the unhurried manner of a man who understood that his work was not urgent because time was on his side. He spent 2 weeks in Vicksburg reviewing county property records. He was specifically interested in deeds executed under Freedmen's Bureau oversight in 1866 and 1867, deeds like the ones that established the land titles of Sorrow's Gate. What he was looking for, and what he found after careful examination of the documents, was something that the Bureau's agents, well-intentioned, overworked, often legally untrained, had frequently failed to ensure: proper chain of title. The parcels purchased by Solomon Vass and Henry Cutter and the other founding families of Sorrow's Gate had been purchased from the Bureau, which had acquired them as abandoned or confiscated Confederate land. But in several cases, the documentation establishing the Bureau's right to sell those parcels was incomplete, not fraudulent, incomplete, missing a step, a signature, a recorded transfer in the chain that led from pre-war owner to Bureau to purchaser. These were technical deficiencies. They were the kind of thing that, in a functioning legal system with a genuine commitment to the rights of the purchasers, would have been corrected as a matter of course, the gap filled, the chain completed, the titles confirmed. They were also in the hands of a man like Clement Farr in a state where federal oversight was weakening and local power was reasserting itself, the beginning of everything. Farr filed his findings with the State Land Office in November 1868. The findings ran to 22 pages of careful legal prose. They concluded that the titles of at least 31 of Sorrow's Gate's land parcels were technically clouded, not void. The document was careful about this, not void, but subject to legal challenge on the grounds of deficient documentation in the chain of transfer. The document was not published. It was not sent to the Freedmen's Bureau. It was not shared with the landholders it concerned. It was filed in the State Land Office in Jackson, where it sat waiting for nearly 3 years. That waiting was the most important part of Clement Farr's work. The document was not a weapon to be used immediately. It was a weapon to be used when the conditions were right, when federal oversight had diminished enough, when the political climate had shifted enough, when the men with the authority to act on it were the men who wanted to use it. Clement Farr returned to Jackson and waited along with it. There was a woman in Sorrow's Gate who knew that something was wrong before anyone else articulated it. Her name was Cora Fell. She was 26 years old, from Memphis, the daughter of a free black minister and a woman who had taught herself to read from a Bible and subsequently taught everyone within her reach. Cora had come to Sorrow's Gate in the late summer of 1867, after hearing about the school through a network of black church contacts that ran through Tennessee and Mississippi, and she had stayed because the children of Sorrow's Gate had looked at her on her first morning there with a hunger that she recognized as the same hunger she had felt at their age. She was small and deliberate, with the kind of stillness that comes not from passivity, but from the enormous amount of attention she was always paying to everything around her. She noticed things that other people mentioned once and moved on from. She kept a journal, not a diary in the sentimental sense, but a record, precise and dated, of things she observed and things she heard and things that seemed to her worth preserving. She had been keeping it since she was 17. In the winter of 1868, she began noting things in that journal that she had not seen before. The county tax collector making a second visit to properties he had already assessed. A surveyor she did not recognize walking the boundary of a parcel at the edge of the settlement, measuring and writing and not introducing himself to anyone. A conversation she had overheard between two white men at the trading post in Howley's Crossing, 2 miles from the settlement, that had stopped abruptly when they noticed her, and that had contained, in the fragment she had caught before it stopped, the words, "that land and not for long." She wrote these observations down. She dated them. She said nothing about them yet because she was not certain what they added up to, and Cora Fell did not speak before she was certain. But she began paying a different quality of attention, the kind that comes when you suspect that the shape of your world is about to be altered, and you want to understand how before it happens, rather than after. In February of 1869, she had a conversation that clarified everything. The man she spoke to was not from Sorrow's Gate. He was a traveling minister named Ezra Mott, associated with an African Methodist Episcopal congregation in Vicksburg, who moved through the Delta settlements performing services and carrying news in both directions, which was, for settlements like Sorrow's Gate, as important as the services themselves. Mott had come through 3 other communities in the previous 2 weeks. He told Cora in the quiet of the church after everyone else had gone that 2 of those communities were facing the same tax irregularities that Sorrow's Gate had been navigating, that a land agent from Jackson had visited both of them, that in one of them a family had already received a legal notice questioning the validity of their deed. Cora asked him to describe the legal notice. He did. She wrote it down. She asked him the name of the family. She wrote that down too. She asked him if he knew who had filed the challenge through which office. Ezra Mott looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has shared information with many people and has rarely been met with this quality of systematic inquiry. Then he told her what he knew, which was not everything, but it was enough. She went to Solomon that evening. She brought her journal. She sat across from him at the table in the room he used as his office. He had built a proper house by now, 2 rooms, a real floor, and she laid out what she had been recording for the past 3 months and what Ezra Mott had told her, and she connected the pieces in the specific way she had been connecting them since the conversation at the trading post. Solomon listened without interrupting. This was his way. When she had finished, he asked her 2 questions. First, did she believe the land office document Mott described was part of a coordinated action or the work of individual actors? She said she believed it was coordinated and told him why. The timing across multiple settlements, the consistency of the approach, the fact that it had not been acted on, which suggested it was being held for a specific moment. And second, did she still have contacts in Memphis who might know something about the political situation in Jackson? She said she did. He looked at the journal for a moment, then he said, quietly, that she should keep writing everything down, every date, every name, every observation, and that she should make a copy of what she had already written and keep it somewhere that was not in Sorrow's Gate. She asked him why not in Sorrow's Gate. He said because if what she was describing was right, there's going to come a moment when the records of this place are going to be challenged, and the challenge is going to be most effective if all the records are in one place where they can be challenged together. Cora understood, and that night she began the work of making copies. What Solomon Vass and Cora Fell had understood, before most of the official record would acknowledge, was that the assault on Sorrow's Gate was not going to be a single act of violence. It was going to be a process, a legal, administrative, bureaucratic process conducted in offices and courtrooms and land registries, using the instruments of a legal system that was technically available to everyone, but practically controlled by the people who had always controlled it. This was in many ways harder to fight than violence. Violence, at least, announced itself. A legal process moved quietly, through channels, in language that was designed to be opaque to anyone without legal training, at a speed that was just fast enough to be effective and just slow enough that each individual step could be characterized as routine. Solomon had spent the winter of 1868 to 1869 doing three things. He had been consulting with every person in the settlement who had any legal knowledge, which included James Abel, who had dealt with property law as a free black man in New Orleans before the war, and a man named Clarence Washington, who had spent 2 years as a clerk for a Freedmen's Bureau legal office in Memphis, and understood the administrative machinery of land challenges better than almost anyone in Warren County outside of the courthouse. He had been writing letters to the Freedmen's Bureau in Washington, to the Republican congressman who nominally represented their district, to a black lawyer in Washington named Daniel Poole, who had been, through a chain of connections that had taken Solomon 3 months to assemble, identified as someone with specific expertise in land title disputes in the post-war South. And he had been watching who in the county's political structure was moving toward the anti-Reconstruction coalition that was consolidating its power in Jackson, watching which bureau officials were being rotated out and who was replacing them, watching the specific individuals, Harlan Brace, Dewey Pitts, the county commissioners, whose behavior would tell him when the waiting was over and the action was about to begin. The letter from Daniel Poole arrived in March 1869. It was 5 pages long, and it was, in Clarence Washington's estimation, the most useful document they had received since the original deeds. Poole had read the description of the title deficiencies that Solomon had sent him, and he had identified a legal argument, narrow, technical, but legitimate, that could be used to challenge any attempt to void the deeds on the basis of incomplete chain documentation. The argument rested on the provision in federal Reconstruction legislation that placed the burden of title challenge to the challenger, not the holder, when the original acquisition had been made under Bureau oversight. Poole wrote that this provision had not yet been tested in Mississippi courts, but that its language was clear enough to create at minimum a genuine legal contest. Solomon read the letter 3 times. Then he gave it to Clarence Washington to read and to Cora to add to her records, and then he did something that he had not done for the preceding 6 months of preparation. He called a community meeting. Not the regular council meeting, a full community meeting. Everyone. In the church on a Wednesday evening in late March, with the spring air coming through the open windows and the sound of the creek outside, and 400 people sitting and standing in a space built for 200. He told them what he knew. Not everything, because there were pieces he was still uncertain about, but enough. He told them about Clement Farr's visit. He told them about the title deficiencies. He told them about Daniel Poole's letter and what the legal strategy looked like. He told them that the fight they had been living inside for 3 years without a name was about to have one. What happened in that room was something that Cora Fell recorded in her journal that night in the specific detail she gave to things she knew were important. The room was quiet in a way that was not frightened, but focused. People asked questions, careful, specific questions, the questions of people who understood the situation and wanted to understand it more completely. A woman named Ada Price asked whether the federal government could be relied on to enforce Poole's legal argument if it came to that. Solomon said he did not know and that he would not tell her otherwise. She nodded. An older man named Thomas Greer, who had been born enslaved and who had more experience than most of the people in that room of being told by legal processes that his position was secure only to have it evaporate, asked Solomon what they should do if the legal strategy failed. Solomon said that was a question he was also working on. He said that planning for a situation was not the same as accepting it, and that he intended to plan for everything. After the meeting, after most people had gone, Cora stayed. She sat with Solomon and James Abel and Clarence Washington, and they talked until midnight about the things Solomon had not said in the meeting. About the fact that Daniel Poole had also written, in a separate paragraph near the end of the letter, that the window for his legal strategy was not unlimited, that if Mississippi succeeded in reconstituting its state government under a conservative Democratic control, as was looking increasingly likely, the provision he was relying on might be legislatively repealed before it could be applied. About the fact that Ashworth's replacement at the Bureau had a different character, more efficient, more bureaucratically precise, but less willing to take positions that might bring him into political conflict with local officials. About the fact that they might win in the courts and lose everywhere else. Cora asked Solomon what he was doing about that possibility. He said he was doing 2 things. He was making sure that every document, every deed, every piece of evidence of Sorrowsgate's legal existence was recorded in as many places as possible, that the original records existed not only in the county courthouse, but in copies held by the Bureau, by Daniel Poole in Washington, by the AME Church in Vicksburg, by Cora's contacts in Memphis. The more places the record existed, the harder it was to eliminate. And he was making sure that the people of Sorrowsgate understood what they were building and why it mattered even if they lost the legal fight. Because the thing you were building was not just for you, it was for the people who came after you, who would need to know it had been done, who would need to know it was possible. Cora asked him if he believed they would win. He was quiet for a moment. He said he believed they would make it very difficult for the people trying to take their land to do so quietly. He said the quiet erasure was the preferred instrument of people like Harlan Brace, and that the most effective thing they could do was to make the erasure as loud and as documented as possible, so that even if it ultimately succeeded, it left a record behind if it could not be entirely destroyed. She wrote that down. The action came in the spring of 1871. It came as Solomon had predicted through the courts, but not through a court in Warren County where the judge was a man named Porter Clay who had been appointed by the newly consolidated Democratic state government and whose relationship to Harlan Brace was close enough that the appointment required no public explanation. It came from the state land court in Jackson, where Clement Farr's 1868 document was finally, 2.5 years after it was filed, submitted as the basis for a formal title challenge to 31 of Sorrowsgate's land parcels. The challenge was filed on a Tuesday morning. The first that Solomon Vass knew of it was a notice delivered to his door on Thursday by a county sheriff's deputy who did not meet his eyes and who rode away without speaking. The notice gave Solomon and the other affected landholders 60 days to respond to the challenge. 60 days to assemble a legal defense for titles that had been legally purchased 6 years earlier. He had been preparing for 2 years. Within 24 hours of receiving the notice, the documents were moving. Letters went out to Daniel Poole in Washington, to the AME conference in Vicksburg, to Cora's contacts in Memphis, to every node of the network that had been quietly built. Clarence Washington drafted the formal response to the title challenge, drawing on Poole's legal argument and supplementing it with 2 years of additional research into the specific document gaps in Sorrow's Gate's deeds and how those gaps could be addressed. Cora wrote to every black newspaper she had a contact at. Not to everyone at once. She was strategic about it. She wrote first to the Chicago Defender's predecessor paper and to the New Era in Washington, and to a paper in Cincinnati. She did not write about the legal technicalities. She wrote about Sorrow's Gate. She wrote about what it was and who had built it, and what the title challenge was actually trying to accomplish. She wrote in the voice she used when she was certain something needed to be said clearly, which was the most compelling voice she had. She also wrote to Marin Hobbes. Marin Hobbes was at that point a 23-year-old reporter for the Chicago paper who had been covering Reconstruction-era land disputes for 2 years, and who had, through that work, developed a specific expertise in the mechanisms by which black land ownership in the post-war South was being dismantled. She was the kind of journalist who understood the story she was being told was almost never the whole story, and who was constitutionally incapable of stopping at the official version. She wrote back to Cora within 2 weeks. She wanted to come to Sorrow's Gate.
She wanted to see the documents. Solomon agreed. He did not agree because he believed a Chicago newspaper would save Sorrow's Gate. He agreed because he understood something about the nature of records, that the more times a fact was written down in the more different kinds of places, the harder it became to unmake it. Marin Hobbes arrived in June 1871, traveling by train to Vicksburg and then by hired wagon to Wren Creek. She was small and precise, with a journalist's habit of writing things down while you were still saying them that occasionally unnerved people who were not accustomed to being recorded. She spent 5 days at Sorrow's Gate. She read every document Cora had. She interviewed Solomon, James Abel, Ruth Carey, Clarence Washington, and a dozen others. She visited the church and the school and the mill and walked the boundaries of the disputed parcels. She wrote a story that ran in the Chicago paper in August 1871. It was 3 columns long. It named Harlan Brace. It named Clement Farr. It named Dewey Pitts. It named the state land court judge who had accepted the challenge. It described the 1868 document in detail. The story produced exactly the response you would expect in Chicago, and exactly the response you would expect in Warren County, Mississippi. In Chicago, it was read with concern and anger by people who were increasingly realizing that what had been won in the war was being systematically dismantled in the peace. In Mississippi, it was noted by Harlan Brace and the men around him as an irritant that did not change the fundamental arithmetic of their situation. They controlled the courts, they controlled the land office, they controlled the county. A story in a Chicago newspaper was a problem for which they had a solution, which was to proceed faster. The legal fight lasted 14 months. Daniel Poole came to Jackson in the autumn of 1871 and argued the case in the state land court with the federal provision he had identified. He was a meticulous and formidable legal presence. The judge listened to him with every appearance of attention. The judge ruled against him in December 1871. The ruling voided 24 of the 31 challenged deeds. Not all 31. 7 were upheld because their documentation chains were complete enough that even the compromised court could not find the deficiency that Farr's process required. 24 were voided on the grounds that the Bureau had lacked clear authority to sell at the time of the original transactions. The decision was appealed.
The appeal was heard by a state Supreme Court that had, in the 18 months since the original filing, been reconstituted under the new state government. The appeal was denied in March 1872. The families on those 24 parcels had 90 days to vacate. There is a particular quality of the grief of a community facing something like this that is different from individual loss. It has a collective weight. The church in Sorrow's Gate on the Sunday after the appeal denial was a place where that weight was present in a way that Cora Fell recorded, but did not try to fully describe. She wrote that there were no words adequate to what the room contained. She wrote the names of the families. She wrote the names of the children. She wrote the details because the details were what remained when the words were inadequate. Solomon Vass held the community meeting that evening. He told them what the families on the voided parcels could still do, which was not nothing, though it was less than it should have been. Some could reorganize their households onto the 7 parcels that had survived. Some could make arrangements with adjacent free black landowners in other parts of the county. The community would not be destroyed entirely. Its geographic shape would change. Its school would continue. Its church would continue. He did not tell them it was going to be all right. He was not that kind of man. What he told them was that what they had built had been real, that no court ruling changed what had been done here, that the children in this room had learned to read in a school that existed because of what the people of Sorrow's Gate had decided to build, and that fact could not be voided by a land court in Jackson. He told them that Marin Hobbs was continuing to write, that Cora's letters were continuing to go out, that Daniel Poole was already preparing a federal challenge that would take longer, but that would not disappear. He told them to make sure the documents were safe. This was the last thing he said before the meeting ended, and it was the thing that Cora heard most clearly. Make sure the documents were safe. She spent the next 2 weeks making 4 additional copies of the complete Sorrow's Gate record, the original deeds, the correspondence with the Bureau, Poole's legal briefs, her own journal entries, the 1868 FAR document that Marin Hobbs had obtained through her newspaper contacts, every piece of evidence of what had been built and what had been done to it. She sent copies to Poole in Washington. She sent one to the AME archives in Philadelphia. She sent one to a free black school in Cincinnati whose principal she had corresponded with for 3 years. She kept one herself, which she carried when she left Sorrow's Gate in the autumn of 1872, moving north to Memphis and then to Chicago, where she would spend the rest of her life teaching school and continuing to write letters that kept the record alive in ways that no county courthouse fire could touch. The physical erasure of Sorrow's Gate happened over the following decade, and it was, as Solomon had predicted, quiet. The 24 voided parcels were resold by the State Land Office in 1873. 14 of them were purchased through a series of intermediary transactions designed to obscure the ultimate buyer by a land consortium whose principal investor was Harlan Brace. The other 10 went to various buyers associated with the rebuilding cotton economy of the Delta. The settlement contracted but did not immediately disappear. The 7 families on surviving parcels remained. The church remained. The school remained for 2 more years until the Mississippi State Legislature, having reestablished full Democratic control, passed a series of education laws that effectively defunded black schools operating independently of white oversight. Cora's replacement teacher, a man named Aldous Green, ran the school for another season out of his own household before it became impossible to continue. The post office designation was revoked in 1874. The official reason given was insufficient mail volume. This was technically true by 1874 because the community's population had declined from 412 to approximately 80, and the mail volume of 80 people is genuinely lower than the mail volume of 412.
The county maps were redrawn in 1875. The community that appeared on the 1870 census as Sorrow's Gate, Warren County, Mississippi, population 412, did not appear on the 1875 county plat. In its place were the names of the parcel's new owners and the designation bottomland. The courthouse records were the last and most deliberate step. In 1876, the Warren County Courthouse in Vicksburg underwent a records reorganization under the direction of the newly appointed county register, a man whose predecessor had actually been a reasonably competent official whose record-keeping had been accurate if imperfect. The reorganization resulted in the original deed records for the Sorrow's Gate parcels being reclassified in the general property ledger under their new owners' names without cross-reference to the previous transactions. This was done in a way that was not technically illegal under the new rules governing record organization. It was simply a reclassification, but that had the effect of making it very difficult for anyone consulting the records to find the chain of transactions that led back to the original bureau sales and the original purchasers' names. And then, in 1879, there was the water damage. The Vicksburg courthouse experienced flooding in the spring of 1879. This was real. The Mississippi River flooded in 1879. The courthouse did take on water. Documents were damaged. The county register's report, filed in June of that year, described the loss of several boxes of records from the 1865-1870 period, including property transaction records from the immediate post-war years. Marin Hobbs, by then writing from Chicago, read the report in an AP wire summary that appeared in the Chicago paper. She recognized it immediately. She wrote a column about it that asked, with the precision she had always brought to this subject, how it was that the specific records damaged by the flooding were concentrated so specifically in the years and categories that would be most useful to challenge in the following decade. She received 3 letters threatening her personally. She noted the threats in her files and continued. She was still writing about Sorrow's Gate in 1887 when she produced the long article that became for decades the primary documentary source on what had happened there. By that point, the physical settlement had been entirely absorbed back into the larger cotton economy of the Delta. There was no visible marker of what had been there. The Wren Creek tributary still ran where it had run. The land was still flat and heavy. But the building Solomon Bass had put up in the spring of 1866, and the church built over 3 Sundays in August 1867, and the school where 400 children had first learned that their minds were worth something, none of it remained in any form that a visitor to that piece of ground in 1887 would have been able to see. The record that Cora Fell had made did not disappear. This is the thing that Harlan Brace and Clement Farr and Dewey Pitts and the state land court judge and the county register and everyone else who had worked to erase Sorrow's Gate either did not understand or underestimated. A record distributed across enough locations, held by enough different people, in enough different forms, becomes very difficult to destroy completely. You would have to know where all of it was. You would have to be willing to pursue all of it. You would have to be operating in a world where no one was watching. The AME archives in Philadelphia had Cora's copy. It sat in storage for 30 years before a researcher working on a history of black land ownership in the post-Reconstruction South found it in 1922. He published a paper that cited it. That paper was read by 11 people. But those 11 people included a librarian at Howard University who added the citation to the university's bibliography of Reconstruction-era land cases, and that bibliography was consulted by a graduate student in 1947 who found the original Cora documents and wrote a thesis that was the first sustained academic examination of the Sorrow's Gate case. The thesis was not widely read, but it was available. Daniel Poole's copies went to the Library of Congress with his papers when he died in 1901. They were correctly cataloged. They sat in a box in a collection that was rarely consulted until a historian working on a comprehensive study of Freedmen's Bureau land cases in the 1960s went through every box in that collection and found them and understood what they were. The copy that Cora had sent to Cincinnati was held by the family of the school principal who received it for 3 generations before being donated to a Black History archive in Ohio in 1955. And the copy that Marin Hobbs had made in 1871, the copy she had taken from Cora's originals and kept alongside her own notes and her correspondence and her 30 decades of writing about Sorrow's Gate, was in a trunk in her home in Chicago when she died in 1911. Her daughter kept the trunk. Her granddaughter donated it to a Chicago Historical Society in 1959. In 1963, a researcher at the Historical Society who had been cataloging the collection found the trunk and opened it and spent 3 days going through its contents. She wrote a letter to a colleague in Mississippi describing what she had found. The colleague, a historian at Tougaloo College, drove to Chicago to see the documents. What she saw in that trunk was not a mystery. It was not an unsolved case. It was a complete record of a deliberate crime, documented with the precision of a woman who understood in 1869 exactly what was going to be needed and had spent the next 40 years making sure it existed. He published an article in 1965. That article was read. It was the first account of Sorrow's Gate to reach a general audience. It produced letters, some hostile, many from people who had always known in the way that communities know things they have collectively decided not to speak aloud, that something had happened in Warren County that the official record did not contain. And then one letter, typewritten, unsigned, whose origin Tougaloo College has never been able to establish, which arrived 3 weeks after the article was published, and which is still in the college's archive, said this: "My grandmother was one of the children in that school. She told me about it every year of my life until she died. She told me about the woman with the chalk. She told me about the man who built the first building. She always said the same thing at the end. She said they couldn't take what we learned. They took the land and they took the buildings, but the reading stayed with us. That's what they never figured out how to take." Solomon Vass died in 1893 in a town in Illinois called Cairo, where he had moved in the late 1870s after the last of the Sorrow's Gate parcels were lost. He is buried in a cemetery there. His grave has a stone. The stone has his name and his dates and nothing else, because Solomon Vass was not a man who believed that stones needed to say very much. James Abel died in Memphis in 1901, still a carpenter, still precise in his work. His descendants are in Memphis today. Ruth Carey lived until 1906 and delivered babies in Cairo, Illinois until she was 80. Cora Fell lived until 1919. She taught school in Chicago for 37 years. She never stopped writing. The journal she had started in Sorrow's Gate in the winter of 1868 was followed by 9 more, covering 50 years of a life lived with the same quality of attention she had brought to reading the surveyor who walked the boundary lines of a settlement she had not yet seen threatened. The journals are in the Chicago Historical Society. They are available to researchers. There is no marker on the land that was once Sorrow's Gate. The Warren County Courthouse in Vicksburg has records of land transactions in the area from 1873 onward, beginning with the names of the purchasers who acquired the parcels after the voiding decision. If you look for the previous transactions in those records, you will find the reclassified entries from the 1876 reorganization. If you look for the entries that preceded those, you will find the gap where the water damage was. But if you go to the AME archive in Philadelphia, or to the Library of Congress, or to the Historical Society in Chicago, or to the archive in Ohio, or to Tougaloo College, you will find Cora Fell's records. You will find the original deeds. You will find the letters. You will find the journal entries, dated and precise, describing a surveyor who was measuring something he had no right to, and two men at a trading post whose conversation stopped when they saw her coming. You will find the complete record of a place that certain men spent decades trying to make disappear. You will find Sorrow's Gate. There is a question that runs under this story that the official records were never designed to answer, and that the erasure was specifically designed to prevent. The question is not what happened. We know what happened. The question is what it means that it happened this way. Not with guns, not with a single dramatic act of destruction, but with a tax assessor and a land agent and a set of legal briefs and a judge and a records reclassification and a flood that damaged the right boxes. The answer to that question is the hardest thing about this story. It means that the most durable forms of injustice are not the ones that announce themselves as injustice. They are the ones that move through the channels of legitimate authority, that use the language of legal procedure, that leave records, but records designed to be read in only one direction. The reason Sorrow's Gate matters, the reason Cora Fell spent 50 years making sure the record survived, is not that it was exceptional. It is that it was representative. What happened in Warren County, Mississippi between 1868 and 1976 happened in hundreds of places across the post-war South. The specific actors were different. The specific legal instruments were different. The specific archives that were damaged or reorganized or lost were different. But the structure was the same. And the structure worked. By the 1880s, black land ownership in Mississippi was in catastrophic decline. By the early 20th century, the gains of the Reconstruction-era were systematically reversed, and the legal mechanisms that accomplished that reversal had been laundered through enough official procedure that they could be characterized by the people who benefited from them as the natural operation of the market. They were not the natural operation of the market. They were the Harlan Brace of it. They were Clement Farr's document sitting in a state office waiting for the right moment. They were the county register reorganizing the boxes. Knowing that is not the same as having been able to stop it. Solomon Vass knew it. Cora Fell knew it. Daniel Poole knew it. They could not stop it. What they could do, and what they did, was make sure it was documented. Make sure the record existed in enough places that it could not be entirely erased. Make sure that the people who came after them would be able to look at what had happened and call it what it was. The woman with the chuck, the man who built the first building, the school where 400 children learned that their minds were worth something. They couldn't take what we learned. This story took decades to emerge from the archives where it was buried. The documents that tell it, Cora Fell's journals, Daniel Poole's legal papers, Marin Hobbs' trunk, the single typewritten letter at Tougaloo College, survived because specific people at specific moments made specific choices to preserve them. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. These are the stories that don't get told enough. Not because the record doesn't exist, but because no one has gone looking yet. We'll see you in the next one.